And here's one more thing about angiosperm features that I briefly wanted to touch upon. We talked about the main synapomorphies or derived traits that angiosperm have, which are flowers and fruits, and I guess double fertilization mostly. But there are several more features that angiosperms have that other plants kind of don't have that will be considered general defining traits of angiosperms, maybe in tests or in books. It's good to know they exist, though, even though they might not be true synapomorphies. Um, a lot of these are, you know, evolved independently by other plant lineages, and a lot of them are lost in some angiosperms, so it's not perfect. But anyways, the most physiologically relevant one, I think, are some new cells that are in the vascular tissue, primarily vessel and sieve tube elements. Basically, in a lot of the other vascular plants like pteridophytes, lycophytes, and gymnosperms, we know that they have tracheids mostly, which are kind of just long cells. But the thing about these tracheids is that they are tapered at the ends, so they are actually tapered to a point and closed off, and therefore for fluid to pass from cell to cell, they have to go through like a cell membrane. The thing about vessel and sieve tube elements is that they are more like cylinders, so they have open ends with these, they're called perforation plates that have no membrane at all, and they can be stacked. Imagine stacking a bunch of cylinders that creates a really big tube, and if there's no membrane, then fluid can pass freely through these tubes, and so water transport is much more efficient in angiosperms thanks to these vessels. You can also see that their radius is much wider compared to tracheids, and according to this equation, which you might see if you also study cardiovascular physiology, I guess, the flow rate of a liquid is actually proportional, roughly, to the radius to the power of 4. And if the radius is so much bigger, then the flow rate is going to be way more fast, I guess. And so, yeah, transport is very efficient, and that's why there's a lot of angiosperms that, have like vines, very thin, but can grow to be very long. So water transport is not really an issue. And it's similar with phloem, with sieve tube elements. There's also a slightly different type of cell that actually packages and loads solutes into the phloem. They're called companion cells. I guess that's a fun tidbit to know. In gymnosperms, they're called albuminous cells. Another thing is that angiosperms have two integuments, which are the tissues surrounding the ovule. You can see there's only one in the gymnosperm. Yeah, I guess. And also a lot of them evolved out of the woody habit and back to a very short herbaceous annual habit, which I'll discuss here. So we can now start actually talking about angiosperms. They are very, very diverse. While there are only 10,000 or so bryophytes and pteridophytes and maybe 1,000-ish gymnosperms, there are 300,000 plus species of angiosperms. So there are so many of them. And they, like most of the major taxa or groups of angiosperms, kind of just arose very quickly in the Cretaceous period. And Darwin was super confused, and he called it an abominable mystery. Usually I use abominable to refer to snowmen, not plants, but we've seen how diverse angiosperms are with their flowers and fruits and seed dispersal, and it's because they can colonize so many habitats, and especially very volatile habitats. And this is thanks to a lot of them losing the woody evolution and becoming herbaceous, which means that they have no wood. Their stems are green and flexible. And along with this, a lot of them are also annuals, which means that they complete their entire life cycle in a growing season. That is, they grow in spring and summer and flower, and then drop their seeds and then die. And then over the winter, the seeds stay dormant and they germinate in the spring. And this makes it so that generations of these plants can quickly colonize areas that may not be so habitable to big plants that need a long time to grow. And it also greatly accelerates the rates of microevolution and speciation. So that helps contribute to the diversification of these angiosperms. And of course, there's so many angiosperms that classification is a hassle. I really had quite a lot of trouble when I was first learning about angiosperm phylogeny. Hopefully, I can make it a little bit easier for you guys to start. I'm not going to go that deep into it because there are a lot of them. And before we go into it, let's take a look at taxonomy, which is naming. It's a little different in plants compared to animals. So taxonomy is generally, you learned it with Linnaeus's kind of nomenclature. So there's binomial nomenclature, where the scientific names have two names, the genus name and the species name, which are italicized. And then there are like the taxonomical like ranks: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. We didn't really see many of these when we were talking about plants, but we are going to start seeing some of them when we talk about angiosperms. Something that plants have are a lot of additional terminology added onto this kind of classic structure. There are some more like sub-ranks under species, subspecies, varieties, and forms, which you can see make for some pretty complicated stuff, because sometimes, botanists discover new plants and think that they're slightly different from the species, so they give it a variety or form or whatever. And because plants are domesticated and bred by humans, there are also cultivars. Cultivars are not like a formal rank. They are just kind of like something that humans chose and were like, hey, this is pretty cool variation. I'm gonna keep it. And they usually have like cool names in quotation marks. There are a lot of like apple cultivars are a good example. Gala, Honeycrisp, Granny Smith. Drop your favorite apple cultivar in the comments below and I'll eat it. I don't know. I really like apples. And there's also hybrids, which you sometimes see in animals as well, but for plants, there's a lot of hybrids because a lot of foods are actually hybrids. So there's an X that shows the things that you're combining. And there are some useful suffixes that will keep popping up over and over again once you really get into the roots of plant phylogeny. There is ales, which means that the thing is an order, and there's aca, which means that the thing is a family. And the thing about angiosperm phylogeny that gets very confusing is that there's a lot of molecular evidence going into it every single day that helps put plants in clades. So clades are those monophyletic groups, which means that it includes an ancestor and all of its descendants. And we love clades. But because there are so many angiosperms, there are a lot of clades. Wherever something branches, you can basically create a new clade. So I'll be talking a lot about clades because whenever something branches, and there will be a lot of branching because there's a lot of angiosperms, a new clade will be formed. I'll try to go over like the most important clades when we get to Eudicots and Monocots at least. But let's get into some actual plants. Hooray! So here's a more simplified tree of the angiosperms. And we're going to start with the basal angiosperms, also known as the anagrade, because their order names conveniently start with A, N, and another A. Yes, very good. Amborella is the only species in this entire order, and it is pretty well known for being the most basal or ancestral angiosperm. That is, it diverged very early off of the rest of the angiosperms. Importantly, it has these relatively undifferentiated flowers, which we'll bump into time and time again, and there are also no vessels. Vessels being the important cells that I pointed out earlier, which makes it confusing on whether vessels are actually a synapomorphy for angiosperms or not. Most people say that they aren't. You can only find Amborella on a little island called New Caledonia, which has a lot of little freaks on it. And the other orders are Nymphaeales, which are a bunch of water lilies, and also Austrobaileyales, which are a bunch of random plants. One that you might know is star anise, that is a part of the Austrobaileyales. So it's good to know that these guys exist because they are the most, ancestral angiosperms. That is, they diverged very early. Okay, now we can talk about core angiosperms, which make up a clade called the mesangiosperms, or Mesangiospermae. And these include three major clades: the Magnoliids, the Monocots, and the Eudicots. The Magnoliids were kind of out the most early, so they are the most ancestral mesangiosperms. But this is where things might start getting familiar. So Magnoliids, you may have seen their flowers before. They're very beautiful, and they also have kind of an undifferentiated morphology, especially with their petals and sepals. So the term tepals is used to refer to the kind of structure when a flower has an undifferentiated perianth. The perianth are the general whorls of the petals and sepals, and if they're undifferentiated, that means they don't look very different from one another. And so that kind of general petal-sepal thing can be called a tepal, and these pop up very often. Tepals are also in the water lilies and Amborella, and also a few other monocots. They also kind of have a spiral morphology, which you also kind of see with some of these plants. Instead of having those concentric whorls of sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels, everything just kind of spirals inwards. And some people thought that that was like an ancestral characteristic of the angiosperms, which means that maybe that the first angiosperms way back in the Jurassic or whatever had that kind of spiral morphology, but we're not really sure, and there's a lot of research going on with it. Magnoliids are kind of recognizable, and they all have like very distinct aromas. They're very aromatic, and they're used as spices a lot of the time. Cinnamon is a magnolid, and black pepper, and also avocado, I guess. So you can eat magnolids, which is pretty good. Okay, the last two major clades are the Eudicots and Monocots. But I want to clear something up because you might see the term dicots sometime. Even in the Science Olympiad trial event rules, they mention dicots for some reason. So let's explain where this kind of distinction comes from and why nobody really likes the term dicots anymore. So in seed plants, the embryo comes pre-packaged with these special leaves called cotyledons, or seed leaves, I guess. And most of the time they have 2 or more cotyledons. Now, in the angiosperms, it was found that a bunch of plants have only one cotyledon, and it was also found that these plants form a clade. That is, all of these plants with one cotyledon are related by a common ancestor, and their common ancestor also had one cotyledon. And this is very interesting. So these plants are called monocots because they have one cotyledon. And all of the other angiosperms with 2, or sometimes they have more, cotyledons are called dicots. So this actually included the basal angiosperms, Magnoliids, and Eudicots, modern Eudicots. But then, as people were conducting molecular genetic studies of evolution, it was found that dicots were not a monophyletic group. That is, monocots actually emerged out of the dicots, after the basal angiosperms and Magnoliids split off. So therefore, the term dicot was dropped because we don't really like paraphyletic groups, we like clades. And so we formed 3 separate clades from within the dicots. The basal angiosperms aren't a clade. Well, basal angiosperms as a group, these 3 clades or orders, the Magnoliids as a clade, and then the rest of the plants that split off at the same time as the monocots were termed the Eudicots, except for a couple of small exceptions, but shut up, we won't talk about them yet. So that is where the term Eudicot comes from, and they are monophyletic and they are a clade, which is very, very good. So because all of the dicots kind of have 2 cotyledons, you don't really use this to differentiate Eudicots from monocots most of the time. The actual formal morphologic difference that Eudicots have is that they have pollen grains with 3 grooves or openings. And this is called tricolpate pollen. So Eudicots formally are kind of known as tricolpates sometimes because this is their main synapomorphy. And monocots, very easy, they have 1 cotyledon. There are also several other morphological differences that usually work. If they want you to ID, these are usually what they are looking for. But formally, these are the main morphologic differences. So Eudicots make up more than 70% of the angiosperms, so most angiosperms are Eudicots. And of course, they are some of the plants that you commonly see and use, and everywhere they're really cool. I want to talk about them. But first, let's talk a little bit about their phylogeny. So Eudicots have two major clades, I guess. So these are not a formal taxonomic rank like class or order or family. They're just kind of an arbitrary word that describes this entire group, monophyletic group of Eudicots. So there are the rosids, which are composed of which are split into two more clades, the fabids and the malvids, and there are a bunch of cool plants here that most of them you can eat actually. And the second clade that makes up the Eudicots, the second major clade I should say, there's a lot of other guys in there, are the asterids, which are composed of the campanulids and lamids. So there are four major clades, I guess. I don't know. Asterids have cool flowers, I guess. And monocots exist as well. Monocots make up the other 29% of angiosperms, and they are kind of, I don't know, goofy looking. When I think of a monocot, maybe it's because I've just been botany pilled for the past few weeks, but I feel like monocots just look like monocots. You just look at this plant and you go, yep, that kind of looks like a monocot to me. I don't know. The thing about monocots is that they kind of lost the ability to have true secondary growth. So there are angiosperm trees that have true wood, but no monocots. Monocots kind of lost that ability to have secondary growth. So there are no true monocot trees or wood.